Thank you very much for your patience. My name is Tom Gaze. I'm director of the Rockefeller Institute. I'm delighted to have such a wonderful audience here today. Friday's employment numbers were a bit disappointing, I know, for many of us. There wasn't that much growth, or at least not nearly as much growth as we might have expected or wanted in unemployment. But it did represent the 30th straight month we've had in employment growth nationally. We also have seen some other good numbers. Our own state and local revenue reports have indicated that state revenues have been increasing every quarter, actually, since early 2010. Now, these numbers are still a bit disappointing. I mean, we've had a very slow recovery, slowest recovery of any recession we've seen for well, really for many, many years. But there's a trend that's also very troubling, and that's the fact that even though we've been seeing economic growth, recovery in many sectors, many of our local governments are still struggling. It's very clear that economic growth by itself doesn't seem to be solving the problems. We're seeing local governments continue to shed jobs. We've seen a 3% drop overall since the start of the recession in local government employment. We've seen a 4% drop in teachers. We've seen public pension liabilities, public pension assets declining substantially, and the contributions that local governments have been having to make to their pension funds have been increasing dramatically, and have started to squeeze, at least in some places, essential public functions. We've even seen, in some places, bankruptcy filings. Stockton, California just joined 3 other cities in the state of California to go into Chapter 9 proceedings. Well, this creates problems nationally as well as in New York. First, it creates problems for essential public services. Local governments are the ones that teach our kids, they repair our roads, they fill our potholes, they inspect our restaurants, they are the first line of defense when we have natural disasters, and they're the governments that are still around when the federal governments are no longer involved in dealing with the aftermath of federal disasters. But it also creates a problem with democratic governance as well. As many of us know, not much can be decided in Washington these days. With political polarization the way it is, they can't even do basic housekeeping functions any longer. And that is also the case, at least in some states. At the local level, we can still make political decisions, but if they don't have the fiscal capacity and longer to really meet new needs, to really deal with emerging problems, and we are having many new emerging problems, then that creates a problem in our federal system so that no government at any level is really capable of responding to the difficulties that the country is facing. So for all these reasons, the Rockefeller Institute has decided to launch a new series of forums on the problems of local government fiscal stress. And we were delighted with our first and featured speaker this week. We want to understand the depth, the distribution, and the causes of this issue, of the problem. We want to know how we can get on top of it, understand it, control it, and if there are things that we can do to sort of get out of it. We have to understand what is it going to take in order to make our cities, our counties, and our school districts fiscally sustainable, not just in the short run, but in the long run. And that's the reason why we're getting started with this series. The series will continue after today with another forum on Thursday with former Lieutenant Governor Dick Ravitch, a gentleman that we have worked with in the past here at the Rockefeller Institute while he was Lieutenant Governor, as well as on his own national task force that he's been heading up with Paul Volcker. And And we are also planning in the fall to have a series of regional meetings around the state on this very issue. Because of the importance of it, we're also joining with a number of stakeholders, some other associations with special expertise, and I like to thank those organizations. They include the New York State Association of Counties, the New York's Conference of Mayors, as well as the associations of towns of the state of New York. Because we're working with local government, so we also wanted to have a special welcome to those of you who are leading local governments and who are being able to come and join us, as well as just offer a perspective from a local government. So before I introduce our featured speaker, I'd like to offer a chance for to have a special welcome from our mayor of Albany, Jennings. Jerry is the 74th mayor of Albany. He's almost been in that office in his 5th term with almost 2 decades. He's a former teacher and a school administrator, so he understands these fiscal issues from the ground up. And he's been very involved in a wide variety of important issues in terms of urban infrastructure, education, gun control, and environmental protection. So, Jerry?
Thank you, Tom, and welcome Comptroller DiNapoli and Supervisor Paul Mahan is here, County Executive Kathy Jimeno, our City Treasurer Kathy Sheen is here as well. If I missed any of the elected, I'm sorry, but I don't know what perspective you want. After 20 years, I don't have enough time to give you the quick overview, but let's face it. You know, it's time for us all to really get together and collectively come up with solutions to the challenges that we've had over the years. We've been so parochial. We have a lot of school districts, a lot of governments, and a lot of taxes being paid in the state. And if we're truly going to be competitive, we really have to come up and be creative. And I'm looking forward to the Comptroller's remarks. So we've had great conversations with Tom since he's taken over. I just want to thank him for the increase in our contributions. 11 years ago it was 5.7 million, I think, or no, it was $500,000. Now it's 17.6 million. Tommy, thank you. That's always covered. It's not his fault, but really, that's just part of the issue. And every year, okay, increased employee contributions, 10-12% increase in health care costs. We all in local government have to deal with that, and that's astronomical when it comes to putting a budget together. And I've watched and listened and talked, and we talk as upstate mayors and mayors from Mayor Yonkers, Rochester, Syracuse, Buffalo. We sit down and talk, and we have the same problems, right? We have kids that are not graduating from our high schools. 50% is nothing to beat your chest about when it comes to urban education. That's a challenge we have to really collectively go after. And I used to work at Albany High School. I was the vice principal. I know a little bit about it. It's not the teachers' faults. We haven't changed the system in years and years and years. Our teachers know how to teach, but my kids have different needs than suburban school kids or rural school kids. So why shouldn't there be flexibility in there for the way our teachers administer whatever they're teaching these kids? If the assessment, and I believe in teacher evaluation, but not just for tests. And a lot of times our teachers are saying we're just teaching to test scores. That's not healthy. That's not healthy for anyone. So we have to come together, and I've had the conversation with Tom here as well as Chancellor Zimfer about what do we do as a state to put a plan together, because it's not just the cities in New York State, it's across the country. If you look at the urban situation as far as graduation, and it's not just about money. It's about attitudes, it's about flexibility, it's about really saying, our kids need more time in schools. They need after-school programs, they need a longer school year. Okay, let's find out, we need preschool for our 3- and 4-year-olds in our cities to prepare them properly so they're not continuing to play catch-up ball. But I could talk about education for a long time. And as far as I'm concerned, when you talk about crime and you talk about the challenge that we have here, do we need a strict gun law? There's no doubt that we do. There's no doubt in this country. We can track guns it's very difficult to track a gun that's used in a crime because there's no consistency across this country. As far as I'm concerned, it's a federal responsibility to say, okay, everyone has to register has to be approved, and the gun manufacturers are going to tell us how many guns they're making a year with the serial numbers and who they sell them to. Okay, let's make it simple, and let's see what we can do so we can stop a lot of the tragedies or easy access to guns that we're having. But as I said, this is not, you're not here to hear me, you're here to listen to Tom. But I thank the Rockefeller Institute for putting this series together, because it's important. This is an important think tank, and really a lot of great ideas are going to come out of it. I'm looking forward to a lot of the speakers that are coming here as far as everything that, you know, we face here in this state. You know, Ravitch is next, and he certainly has an understanding of what's going on. But when I took office in 1994, there was 74% of the property in the city was tax exempt. We're down to about 54, okay? That's still a lot. You know, and that's why I lobbied so hard for 19A payments and fairness, because I've watched the State Assembly and Senate work for 20 years, and prior to the last couple of years, there was never an on-time budget, basically. And there were decisions that were made late at night, and it was saying, okay, this city's in trouble, let's give that some spin-up aid for here, and it would stay there. So the discrepancy between and amongst the cities is astronomical when it comes to AIM. That's funding for all of our municipalities. So that has to be corrected. And we have to, first of all, admit there's a problem. Second of all, get in a room together and say, you know, if it's good for Albany, it's good for Colony, it's good for Schenectady, it's good for Troy, it's good for the region. And I really say thank you, Tom, for putting this together. And I welcome everyone here, and we're going to have a great conversation with our Comptroller, because he gets it, he understands the challenges we have, and thank you all for coming. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jerry. Well, New York State Comptroller Tom DiNapoli really is the perfect person to get this series launched. Tom assumed the office in 2007 and was elected for a full 4-year term in 2010. And no one else can really provide such a broad picture about the state of local governments in New York State. He audits local governments regularly. He oversees the New York State retirement system, state and local retirement system, I should say. He gives public access to extensive financial data on government revenues and expenditures through his open book New York website, and he's issued a series of major reports on state and local fiscal issues in recent months and the year. Tom also knows local governments from his years before becoming Comptroller. I mean, he was actually, we found out, the youngest person in New York to hold public office when he was elected to the Mineola Board of Education at the age of 18. And of course, as 2 decades as a member of the Assembly, he spent a large amount of his time trying to restore fiscal responsibility to Nassau County and its school districts. Throughout his career, Tom has been widely regarded as a decent, smart, upstanding public servant, even by those who don't agree with him. I know this personally. He stole my deputy director just about a year ago, Bob Ward, but he did it in a very open, transparent, good government sort of way. I knew it was coming. I was not stabbed in the back. It was a full forward thrust. So with that, Tom, please come up.
Tom, you got back at me for that one, I can say. Boy, oh boy. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'll try to maneuver back and forth. I see it's a full house. Thank you, Tom, for that very kind introduction. And I love when people mention that first race of mine. But I love it even better when you don't mention what year it was. Because whenever people say 1972, everybody starts calculating, oh, he's that old? I can't believe it. And I also chaired the local government committee, I might point out, when I was in the Assembly, as another perspective and another vantage point. But really thanks, Tom, to you and your colleagues for organizing not only this morning, but the series of forums that you have upcoming. And thank you for having it start off with a welcome from Mayor Jerry Jennings. In that brief welcome that the mayor offered, he really framed many of the issues, even beyond what I was going to touch on this morning, that are challenging our cities and all of our localities. And I appreciate Mayor Jennings' efforts. He and I kid each other every now and then, but we have a great relationship, and he has been one of the leading voices to talk about bringing people together around these issues. So Jerry, thanks for everything you do. Give him another round of applause for coming out this morning. And he complained to me I didn't show up right at 11 sharp, but I said, hey, you know, gives more time for people to come hear you. So that's what it's about. And I am a big fan of what goes on here at Rockefeller Institute. You're a very important institution, not only in the city, but really for all New Yorkers, and certainly a national leader in the study of state government. Now, Tom, I'm going to read the next part exactly as it's written. You'll appreciate this. In fact, I think so highly of the Rockefeller Institute, last year I stole one of your stars. And you didn't get an advance copy of what I was going to say. But we're delighted to have Bob Ward with us. He certainly added a great deal to our budget and policy group, although I'm told he's still on probation, so you may get him back. You know, you never know. But so far, so good. This forum series and past forum series, and it's been a couple years since I've been part of your program, but I can recall speaking at other times, you always produce interesting and very relevant discussions, and I'll try very much to hold up my end of the bargain in that regard this morning. And as Tom indicated, I'm going to focus on the current challenge of fiscal stress facing our local communities across our state, give you some of my thoughts about where we're at and how we can perhaps better address this challenge moving forward. There's a lot, as Tom indicated, that our office has been doing in this area, and I'm not going to touch on every single piece of it or every single facet of it. I'd need more than my allotted half hour to do that. So I may restate some of what you've already heard. I'm not going to touch on all of the issues and perhaps add some new thoughts as well. So we'll get right into it. It's no exaggeration to suggest that as a state, we've been through one of the most difficult economic periods in our history. The Wall Street earthquake, if we can call it that, or meltdown, whatever phrase you want to use, of 2008, 2009, and the resulting rolling tsunami of job losses across the nation and here in New York was a profound economic event, one that cost our state billions of dollars in lost revenue and hundreds of thousands of jobs. Looking at the latest economic indicators, we see more positive than negative. There are certainly clear signs of a recovery. But the recovery, as I've said on many occasions, is a very tentative one, a very tenuous one, and certainly a very, very slow one. So it's very, very clear that the challenges remain ahead, particularly when you look at that issue of job creation in the aftermath of the meltdown. And we know some of the latest numbers were somewhat disappointing in that regard. When you look, though, at the job numbers from a statewide perspective, the good news is that at this point, where we're at in 2013, New York has recovered all the jobs that were lost and then some. Okay, so we're at about 111% now in terms of comparing where we are with jobs in New York today versus the depths of the recession. The challenge when you look at those statewide numbers, though, is that it's a very uneven picture, and it differs depending on where you live in our state. New York City, the 5 boroughs, have regained 175% of the jobs that were lost during the recession. Long Island is a little over 100%, and that's just in the past few months, in terms of where Nassau and Suffolk happened to be before the downturn. The Ithaca area regained nearly 4 times as many jobs as were lost during the recession. Rochester and Buffalo regained about 3/4 of the jobs that they lost. Other areas haven't fared so well. Capital Region regained about 51%, a little over half. Syracuse, only about 38% of lost jobs. The Glen Falls area, a mere 16%. And you can go down the list of the different statistical areas in our state. And again, you're seeing growth, but it varies depending on where you're at. And you look at even New York City, where you see very robust recovery in terms of job numbers. It's a different economy in terms of job creation than it was. You look at past post-recessionary times where typically it was Wall Street, it was financial services that led the way in job creation. That's not what we're seeing now. In fact, Wall Street, after gaining back about 1/3 of the jobs that the securities industry had lost, the firms, as part of their effort to keep profitability up, and they certainly are profitable once again, they are downsizing, and you're seeing continued or renewed job loss in sectors of the securities industry. So the jobs that have been created in the place of those Wall Street jobs that have not come back are lower compensated jobs, because obviously the securities jobs are very, very well compensated. So all of that has an impact in terms of the overall economic dynamic and certainly in terms of the revenue picture for our city and for our state. Another area of that we always mark in terms of where we're at with economic activity and health is the housing market. We're seeing an uptick in the housing market in terms of sales. The most recent report put out by the New York State Association of Realtors showed statewide home sales in 2012 finished 7% ahead of 2011. So certainly statewide we're seeing more activity. Again, in terms of increase in the value of homes, that varies dramatically as well. And in many cases, you're not seeing a great increase in terms of the price of homes. At least you're seeing more activity. So more positive than negative in terms of the economy. I'll leave it there in terms of indicators. There are others we could go into. But suffice it to say, even though there are signs of recovery, we know that in too many of our communities, all is not well. Communities across New York continue to face significant budgetary and fiscal problems. What are those challenges? A confluence of factors depending on how you look at it. Some communities facing all of these, some facing some of them. And they include decreasing tax bases, growing fixed budget costs, losses in population, a deteriorating industrial sector. All of these factors for many of our communities, certainly not all, but too many, have conspired to create chronic budget gaps, significant fiscal stress in many counties, cities, towns, and villages across New York. Now, as Tom mentioned, we have been spotlighting the fiscal stress issue that are being felt by our local governments. We've been doing that with an increase in the reports that we put out in this area and the fiscal profiles that we've been putting out as well. The deeper we look, I think the numbers point out the clarity of the problem that's confronting us. So just to recap some of what we've been reporting. In August, we released a report that found that nearly 300 local governments had deficits in 2010 or 2011. More than 100 had inadequate cash on hand to pay their current bills. The report also highlighted that widespread declines in property values have created downward pressure on the single largest local government revenue source, the property tax. Municipalities are also suffering from declines in other major revenue sources, such as the sales tax and the mortgage recording tax. Additionally, state aid and incentives for municipalities, the AIM payments, have declined or been stagnant for the past 5 years. Since 08-09, AIM has been reduced by $50 million and has been completely eliminated for the city of New York. Last month, my office released our latest report on the issue, focusing on slow aid growth to local governments over the past decade. Again, highlights from this report: from 2001 through 2011, total federal and state aid to municipalities has failed to keep pace with inflation. The relative share of federal and state aid as a percentage of total local government revenue decreased from 22% in 2001 to 20% in 2011. To cover expenses, local governments have been forced to rely more heavily on revenues generated through sales taxes and real property taxes. State funding to localities grew by only 1.2% on an average annual basis over that decade. As a result of all these pressures, municipalities across New York eliminated 32,000 jobs from 2009 through 2012, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. We have to believe that these cuts resulted in some loss of services as well. Now, if the task of balancing increasing costs and decreasing state revenue and local tax receipts weren't enough of a challenge, local governments now must budget within the confines of a property tax cap or seek a supermajority override. As you know, local governments and school districts must submit reports on their tax cap calculations to the Comptroller's office. Since the cap was enacted in June of 2011, my office has been doing all that we can to help local governments deal with the new law. We provided training to over 7,100 local governments and school districts across the state. We've convened over 70 training sessions. Our current data shows that well over 90% of local governments and school districts have complied with the reporting requirements of the law. And given the fiscal pressures that localities are facing, I think that level of compliance is truly impressive. And when they're not complying, we work with them to get them into compliance. We don't have hard numbers in terms of how many actually ended up overriding the cap. We'll be collecting that data. What we get is the intent to override, and as you know, many, as a placeholder, do the motion to override, and then they don't, in fact, override the tax cap. But suffice it to say, the vast number of local governments have not been overriding the cap. And as we get more hard data on those numbers, we will certainly include that in our future reports. But while local governments have certainly done a commendable job of complying with the tax cap law, it's also no doubt that they will continue to face a challenge in meeting with that cap in the coming years, particularly in light of increasing local needs and demand for services, and in many cases, decreasing fund balances. In fact, we know that the tax cap impact will grow over time because of the power of compounding. The difference of a percentage point or two a year builds up over many years. Now, one way to get a perspective on the impact of the tax cap on local revenues is to look at the experience of our New York school districts from 2000 to 2010. Compare that experience to what we can project perhaps moving forward. From 2000 to 2010, property tax revenue for school districts across the state rose by an average of 5.4% a year. Our local government division issued a report showing that in its first year, the new tax cap limited school district tax levies to an average increase of 3%. So if you take the difference between that 3% annual increase and the 5.4% annual increase we saw over the preceding decade, we certainly see a dramatic impact that perhaps suggests how we move forward. If the average annual revenue growth over 2000 to 2010 had been 3% instead of 5.4%, the cumulative difference by 2010 would have been $3.4 billion statewide. That amounts to real property tax relief for New Yorkers, but it also represents $3.4 billion less in local revenue for schools to spend on providing services that many New Yorkers expect. And while the numbers may differ, you could use a similar comparison in terms of impact on our municipal governments as well. So we can assume that if the current tax cap remains in place for the coming decade, the long-term impact on school and municipal budgets will total additional billions of dollars. Our reports also demonstrate that the fiscal challenges confronting local communities are not a passing problem. And that's really one of the challenges facing our local officials who are here and local officials all across our state. The reality is this is the new normal for the foreseeable future. Difficult budgeting choices remain and will continue. The path to more accurate and realistic budgeting begins with an honest conversation about the numbers. To help in this process, as you all know, our office recently finalized our fiscal stress monitoring program, and we of course have copies for everybody. Looks like this. When you walked in, you'll see it. It's an early warning system to identify local governments facing significant fiscal stress, so corrective actions can be taken before a full financial crisis develops. The program will use the self-reported data that local governments already provide to our office to calculate an overall score of fiscal stress for municipalities and school districts across our state. It's no new mandate, no additional reporting requirement. We have this information already. What we're really doing differently now, instead of using it for our internal purposes to drive an audit or a research report or an outreach to a local government, we're going to take that information, categorize it in what we hope will be a clear and understandable way for local officials and for the public, and really create an opportunity to give a more clear and public picture of what's happening with our municipalities. Municipalities and school districts will be classified as in significant fiscal stress, moderate fiscal stress, susceptible to fiscal stress, or not in fiscal stress. And we rolled this program out in the fall and gave local officials time to react to this proposal, and we made some changes based on that input that we received. And as I said, it's really meant to be an early warning system, have us all understand a little more clearly what's happening out there. We'll start to release the scores in just a few weeks. And let me say very clearly, I expect in some cases it's going to be a painful wake-up call for local communities and for some local officials. In too many cases, I don't think people fully appreciate the fiscal reality that is confronting our local governments right now. Now, what do we do with that information? Well, from our perspective in the Comptroller's office, once we determine that a locality or a school district is in fiscal stress, there are services that we will step up and attempt to provide. These include budget reviews, technical assistance on budgeting, multi-year financial planning strategies and techniques, and training opportunities for local officials. So we are not trying just to put this information out there. We're going to use this as a way for us to step up the support that we can try to provide. I was very pleased that we got a thumbs up from Moody's, who looked at our system. to help local governments better identify their fiscal troubles. They identified this system as credit positive, and we take this as confirmation of our belief that more information, even if at times it's tough to hear, will ultimately lead to better budgeting practices. Now, because this is not a short-term crisis but a long-term challenge, we need long-term thinking to address it and to solve it. We're continuing to face deep challenges for all classes of municipalities and school districts, almost 4 years after the recession supposedly ended. That being said, our cities outside of New York City, truly are on the front line of fiscal stress, and we need to acknowledge that. Although the national economy continues to experience modest growth, all projections indicate that the financial and economic challenges we see today will be with us for some time to come. There are no easy or simple solutions. I was not going to come here today and wave the magic wand and tell you how it's all going to go away. But I can comment on some thoughts we have for moving forward, and I want to start by commenting on some of what we're seeing in other states that I do not think is the way for us to move in the future. Some suggest that localities go bankrupt, like a private corporation, and look for a turnaround. Our local finance law allows municipalities to file a bankruptcy petition, but no local government in New York has ever chosen that path, and I think with good reason. At best, it's filled with uncertainty because decision-making authority moves from voters and local officials to a judge who may need to balance the interest of creditors with the particular needs of an individual community. At worst, bankruptcy can drag on for years and still produce no good resolution, as we've seen in places like Vallejo, California, and you know, in the recent news, other municipalities in California are moving down this path. And it's very much uncharted waters, and it will take a long time for the courts to sort through all the obligations. The other piece of bankruptcy is that the process itself can be very, very expensive. Legal fees in the case of Jefferson County, Alabama, are currently more than $1 million a month, $1 million a month. Setting the bankruptcy precedent in New York would send the wrong signal to the municipal bond market. Such a step could make investors think twice about lending to other municipalities, especially those already suffering from significant fiscal stress. And this negative perception, in turn, could increase borrowing costs for those fiscally challenged localities that are least able to absorb additional strain on their budgets. Could have implications for the state in terms of its borrowing as well. So as the state's chief fiscal officer, I do not see bankruptcy as a productive process for local governments. Now, in the past, when some localities have been unable to solve chronic problems, the legislature has imposed a Comptroller oversight board. While the mechanism can be helpful, we have seen that control boards do not necessarily lead to immediate solutions. My home county of Nassau is one illustration. The Nassau Interim Finance Authority has had some positive impacts. I certainly see that. Yet 13 years after the board was created, the financial condition of the county is still precarious. Even if we believe that control boards can help lead to solutions in some cases, taking decisions out of the hands of local elected officials should only be used in extreme circumstances. And there does not seem to be, quite frankly, an appetite to create more control boards across New York State. So what can we do? What should we do? Let me offer the following principles on which to base future policy choices at both the state and local levels as we continue to deal with this new normal. First, knowledge is power. Let's get the facts and put them in front of the people who pay the bills, the taxpayers. While many New Yorkers are generally aware that their local governments are struggling, the details are both critically important and in some cases very complicated. The results of the fiscal stress monitoring system that I reviewed with you a few moments ago and we'll be starting to release in just a few weeks will help New Yorkers understand the financial condition of their local governments more clearly. This system builds on the work that we continue to do with our fiscal profiles, our audits, and our other reports. I urge elected leaders and voters in every community to look closely at our fiscal stress index and think about what each locality needs to do to address its own unique challenges. We must intensify the good efforts that are already underway in many communities to identify options and confront difficult budget choices to move toward lasting solutions. It must be understood that the longer we delay, the more elusive the outcome will be. Second, we need to understand that not all stress is created equal, and so not all stress requires the same solution. Some stress is caused by poor financial planning on the local level, while other stress can be attributed to external factors. Education, increased training, technical assistance, more attention to develop local elected leadership can help municipalities grapple with these issues. For instance, the organizations that are co-sponsoring today's events, the Conference of Mayors, the Association of Counties, the Association of Towns, are doing important work in providing technical assistance and training. We need to make sure we're doing all we can to help elected officials learn about long-range financial planning and to use the tools that contribute to better budgeting and stronger financial condition. The Comptroller's Office continues to be a partner in these efforts. But as my fiscal profiles of cities around the state are pointing out, our cities in particular are facing broad social trends in many ways beyond their control that are pushing them into fiscal crisis. Working to reverse those trends means we need to continue working on rebuilding the local tax base. Economic growth drives more property tax revenues without higher tax rates. It creates more jobs, which in turn generate higher sales tax and income tax revenue. One important step for our cities in particular is working more effectively to bring brownfield properties back onto the tax rolls for both economic and environmental benefits. Rebuilding the tax base also means being smarter and more discriminating about our use of tax incentives, including in the brownfield program, which in some cases fail to generate net new economic activity for our communities and for our state. We know that we've not yet found the answers to the troubling long-term economic difficulties facing many of our local communities, especially in our cities outside of the city of New York. But we do see the brownfield program as one area that's ripe for updating and for reform. I'm going to be releasing a report on our recommendations with regard to how we can improve that program, and I hope we could do better and have that contribute to economic growth in our state. And since I was the sponsor of the bill, I feel I'm allowed to make suggestions on how to make it better, right? If I have pride of authorship. Jerry wants to see the report right away, he said, right? All that leads to a third principle. It's time for a more comprehensive agenda to assist our local governments. That agenda must include a clear-eyed assessment of the economic and social challenges confronting our urban centers, practical analysis of what we can do to start a turnaround after decades of decline in too many cases, and a renewed commitment to help from the state. Forcing cities, and I'm mentioning cities a lot because, again, that's the front line of stress, to depend heavily on a stagnant or shrinking property tax base will not be viable much longer if we want healthy, vibrant cities. And we need our cities to be fiscally healthy and vibrant if we want to promote economic development, give people a reason to move back to our cities. As I mentioned before, funding for aid and incentives to municipalities, our AIM funding, our primary general purpose assistance for local governments, is lower this year than it was 5 years ago. Although every major program area in our state budget certainly took cuts during and after the Great Recession, we take for granted that in most years there'll be some increase in funding for programs like healthcare, education, transportation, economic development. This has not been the case with general purpose municipal assistance. AIM funding is a comparatively small part of the overall budget at $715 million this year. Compare that $715 million to the more than $25 billion in state funds we'll spend this year on health, more than $26 billion that we will devote this year to K-12 and higher education, or the other billions of dollars that we commit to transportation, prisons, economic development, and so on. Although this was a very tough budget year once again, as you know, the enacted fiscal plan includes significant new funding for various programs and tax reductions, including a $350 rebate for certain families that will cost approximately $400 million a year starting in 2014. As the economy improves and as resources become available, an increase in support that could provide welcome help to localities could be provided with relatively modest impact on the overall financial plan. For example, even a 50% increase in AIM funding represents less than 1/2 of 1% of the state's operating budget. Certainly, they'll do a lot to hold down local property taxes and help our localities across the state. If we simply went back to the AIM levels that were promised in 2007, localities across the state would receive $134 million in additional aid this year. The bottom line is we need to do more to help struggling municipalities and do it as soon as we can. Now, as Comptroller, I understand my role. I respect that the legislature and the governor are the ones to make the policy choices as to specific expenditures in the state budget. But at the same time, it's very clear, as happens in every budget year, we have to recognize that choices are made, and that was the case this year. Choices to provide new resources for certain programs, and that's happened even in tough times. The fiscal and social challenges facing our local governments deserve a more prominent place in our budgetary priority. And I do think it's time to re-examine the fiscal relationships between the state and local governments. And again, we do it through the prism of the impact on cities. And when you look at our local governments and who benefits most from the AIM program, we see that for cities, it represents about 20% of their budgets, the state assistance. Single digits when you look at the impact on towns and villages. But AIM would still seem to be the way to channel additional help to our municipalities that are struggling. Even in this year's budget, even with the tough challenges, there was a small increase in funding for our villages. I think this is appropriate because as we look at municipalities in fiscal stress, we need to recognize that villages in our state often function as small cities. Many of our villages share the economic and social challenges that we more commonly associate with cities, and villages typically receive lower levels of aid than cities that are similar in size and responsibility. So again, we just finished a budget cycle. We'll look to see where we're at as we, before you know it, talk about next year's budget. But we need to make an assessment of where we're at with our economy, what's the revenue picture coming to the state, and if in the next budget cycle, as happened in this budget cycle, there is discussion of additional funding for programs, we really do need to elevate the discussion of how we're treating our municipalities, and perhaps is it time for us to look at the AIM program as a program that needs additional support. A fourth principle, accountability is essential. As we think about increased support for fiscally stressed local governments, we want to reward and create incentives for responsible budget practices and responsible budget choices. Any future increase in state assistance could and should be combined with heightened accountability in the form of required multi-year financial planning and regular reporting on the municipality's efforts to move towards structural budget balance. Legislation enacted in 2006 and 2007 included just this kind of combination, increased aid and greater accountability. But those provisions were temporary and they're no longer in effect. If the 2007 provisions for AIM were in effect this year, as I mentioned a few moments ago, localities across the state would be receiving $134 million in additional aid. And more local governments would be engaging in the long-term planning that can help lead to real solutions before fiscal stress reaches a critical level. As we encourage and incentivize better long-term planning, we need to provide additional tools to make such planning truly effective. One tool that I proposed in the past, and I'll mention it again today, we've proposed legislation that would allow the creation of a statewide fund in which localities could set aside money in trust for post-employment health care and other benefits. We know these costs are coming and growing. We often talk about pension, as was mentioned earlier, and health care costs together. With regard to pensions, though, we need to keep in mind that although we've been going through this time of recovery from the loss in 08 and 09, our projections are, not this year, but the year after, we will see pension rates stabilize and hopefully start to come down. No one's projecting that with regard to health care costs. And although there is always concern when we have the increase in the pension costs, the reality is we pre-fund our pension obligations. That's the purpose of the Common Retirement Fund. That's something we do not do with retiree health benefits for our public employees. So while we are certainly confronted with difficult choices today, we need to start looking for more of the long-term structural changes that will help us down the road. And I think establishing an OPEB trust in the state that the state and the local governments can participate in would very much be a step in the right direction. I also think we need to do more to promote shared services between our local governments. We know that localities can save taxpayer dollars by working together. Local leaders across our state are doing that each and every day. The state's local government efficiency grant program is one way to help localities get started. My office also provides training and analysis on shared services opportunities. I do think this is an area where we should be more aggressive and we should provide more incentives. We certainly need to look at the experience in other states. Compared to states like Pennsylvania, North Carolina, New York has relatively few carrots and sticks at its disposal to help steer fiscally troubled local governments into a more sustainable path before problems reach a critical level. As many of you know, currently the legislature generally becomes directly involved only when a local government seeks enhanced borrowing authority to pay off an accumulated deficit. By that time, taxpayers are already incurring interest costs for cash flow debt associated with operational expenses, the kind of borrowing that we really should avoid. When a municipality reaches the level of severe fiscal stress that forces local officials to approach the legislature for special borrowing authority, the results at times are unpredictable, and the level of state involvement in and the monitoring of local finances can vary significantly. As you know, each statute attached to borrowing looks a little different. We don't have a one-size-fits-all response to those situations. All of this is one more reason that both local government policies and practices and the state's own response must be directed at resolving fiscal challenges before they reach the crisis point, where either you're coming to the legislature for borrowing or looking for some kind of an oversight mechanism. A fifth principle that should guide us as we move forward: engage the public. It's a very simple premise. Taxpayers that foot the bills should be involved in the decision-making process. Voters owe it to themselves to learn more about the budgetary choices being made in their communities and to support local elected officials who are willing to make the tough but necessary choices. And in an era of greater demand for governmental transparency than ever before, I urge our local officials to go the extra mile to inform their constituents and seek their input. Change is never easy. More communication and more citizen engagement can help move the difficult but necessary decisions more quickly. My office will continue to assist those decisions by making more information available to elected leaders and to our state citizens. In addition to the ongoing series of reports that I've mentioned, our Open Book New York website provides a wide variety of data on local government spending, revenues, tax limits, and other fiscal indicators. As part of our continuing commitment to open government and transparency, we're looking at adding more data sets to Open Book New York in the months ahead, so stay tuned on that effort. It's worth recalling that when New York City approached bankruptcy in the mid-'70s, all parties in the process, state and local elected officials, the business community, labor, and others came together to find solutions. The reality is we need those kind of partnerships today to meet the difficult challenges that are facing us. We need those partnerships on a statewide basis. We need them in each of our local communities that are struggling as well. Because the reality is tough decisions start at home. Yes, it would be welcome if the state could do more, especially to help our most fiscally challenged local governments. But the reality is the landscape is not going to change dramatically overnight. Local elected leaders are going to have to make tough decisions, and they're going to have to continue involving their citizens in the discussion regarding the best options among difficult choices. Obviously, the state has its own budgetary challenges, and that's not going to change overnight, and we need the state to stay in fiscal balance. Unfortunately, we've been in better shape over the past couple of years. That's an important underpinning to growing our state's economy. And I've always been of the belief, going back to my days on that school board a long time ago, that even when you're in a tough year, there are always options, there are always choices. And there are always going to be better choices, and those choices may vary from community to community. Again, that underscores the need for us to do a better job of informing the public as to what's going on. Give the public the opportunity to have input in setting those priorities, even when they involve difficult choices. Even if an increase in state aid becomes possible through the AIM program, that alone is not going to solve the problem. And even if we do manage to bring every fiscally stressed municipality out of the red, we owe it to the taxpayers to make sure we're using their resources as cost effectively as possible. Again, that's where our office has an important role to play. And you certainly have my commitment that our auditors will continue working with local officials to help make that happen. Not in a punitive way, unless it's required, but in a helpful way to point out how operations could be more efficient and more effective. I urge local leaders to think about today's fiscal challenges while also contemplating the long-term impact of the solutions that are being considered. This, as I said, is a challenge for the state itself, and we'll be putting out our report on the state budget shortly to give our analysis as to where we're at right now. Look, though, as local elected leaders, to our local government school district accountability web portion on our Comptroller's website. We have a lot of information there that I think will be useful to you. We have a lot of tools there that I think are helpful. And I always try to remind my staff, even when we've done training, we sometimes forget that there's always a change, there's always a turnover at the local level. There's always some new folks selected to a school board or a village board or a town board, city council and so on. And we always need to have this information available so that the new crop of elected leaders can understand what's going on and be brought up to speed as quickly as possible. We can and must find ways for government to operate more cost effectively. But we must also make tough choices involving the level of public services and the price that taxpayers are willing to pay. So to summarize, the charge for state and local governments really is similar. Be more efficient, collaborate more often, share ideas, engage the public, think long-term. The sooner that all of us at both the state and local levels address the very real challenges facing our local governments, the better off we'll be. The good news is that we have made some efforts in this regard. As you know, the state has addressed some of the big issues that have been out there. Certainly the increased takeover of additional Medicaid costs that has benefited our counties, I think, has been a significant step. While we don't recommend it across the board for those in the greatest stress, the amortization program that we offer to help manage rising pension costs is another option that helps to get people through a tough time if they want to make themselves available to utilize that mechanism. And in this year's budget, there's another iteration of that program that's been made available. But it doesn't get us away from the fact that we need a renewed effort for innovation, for action, for leadership. Although I have always been a great optimist, that's why I continue to stay in government, and I'm certainly an optimist about where we're at in New York State. We, I believe, will create a better way as we move forward. And if we get a little more of positive news on the economic front, it will hopefully make our ability to find those solutions a little easier to come by than they have been in the recent past. And that really gets back to how I started my comments, and that's to commend the Rockefeller Institute for providing, as always, a platform for very thoughtful discussion and debate on the important issues facing our communities. It's this kind of dialogue that we need now more than ever. I know you're having former Lieutenant Governor Dick Ravitch speaking with you later this week, and from my perspective, the Ravitch-Volker Task Force has done an incredible job of putting a spotlight on the fiscal crisis facing state and local governments all across our country, not just here in New York. I appreciate their work, and I'm certainly going to look forward to Dick's comments. I actually saw him at the end of last week, so I know he's prepping hard to speak with you. But I think part of what we'll learn by doing the comparisons with other states that you'll hear from Dick Ravitch is that we're not alone. And in some cases, we're actually a little better off perhaps than some other states. Although I think what we'll also get a sense of is that to a certain extent we are in uncharted territory when we talk about some of these issues. And because of the continuing grip of a very, very slow economy, it just makes the ability for us to have an option of solutions much more limited than we'd like it to be. But as we know, New Yorkers rise to challenges each and every time, and I'm confident as I travel the state and I get to know even better the local government leaders we have at the school and municipal level, there's a lot of creativity out there. There's a very strong commitment to helping navigate communities through these tough times. And I'm very optimistic when we come back a year or two from now to talk about the state of local governments, we'll have some good news to report. And we hope the Comptroller's Office will be a part of that good news. I'll end it there.
The Institute would be delighted to work with your office on public engagement or any of the analytical issues. Related to that, I should mention that I do now have a new deputy director. Robert Bullock here has been formerly president of the New York Archives Partnership Trust, has actually put together this forum as well as working on the future series.
I already have his contact information, so.
Right, yes.
Only kidding, only kidding.
Well, Bob, just leave the room right now. In any event, I will now allow questions to be answered. When you do ask your questions, please identify yourself. We're recording everything, so we want to know who to blame for any of these questions. So, does anybody have any comments, any questions, or brief comments and questions? Yes, CJ.
Hi, AJ.
EJ, please identify yourself.
EJ McMahon, Empire Center for New York State Policy. Uh, Tom, your office has done a lot of work to try to encourage local governments to engage in long-term financial planning. There was actually a requirement to produce long-term financial plans tied to AIM increases, and then AIM stopped increasing.
Right.
But as you also know, while you provide all the tools and even templates for local governments to do this, hardly any do. Even those local governments and school districts that engage internally in long-term plans do not share them with the public.
Mm-hmm.
In light of your commitment to encouraging local governments to take a longer view, two of your points were to be long-term and engage the public. Do you think the time has come to actually mandate, using that dirty word, on the state level, that local governments and school districts begin preparing and updating regularly long-term financial plans, that is 5-year plans, current year inclusive, beginning perhaps with those local governments and school districts that are opting into the pension deferral options, since this has long-term consequences in combination with other factors? I'd be interested in hearing your view on that.
It's an important question. Thank you, EJ. And thank you for all of your thoughtful analysis on these issues as well. I hadn't thought of it in terms of the amortization program, and to the extent that that program is already established, I don't think we'd be looking to add that as a requirement. But I do think that, as you point out, the requirements that came with the enhanced AIM funding of previous years, especially tied to those that are in the greatest stress, I think that we should try to couple that, assuming that we do see a time where we can increase the AIM funding. I think it would make sense to have as a requirement that kind of increased financial planning, hopefully included with an openness and transparency to the public. You know, I mean, you said it right. The M word is a difficult one. Of course, a mandate often depends on where you're sitting as to whether it's a mandate or a good government practice or whatever it may be. And I didn't touch on the question of mandate really, because I know that's still a big issue with many of our local government officials. And we certainly, recognizing what our role is, we have no ability. As I mentioned, other states have different kinds of leverage points. You see what's happening, for instance, in Michigan, where they're going in and taking over Detroit right now. We don't have that kind of structure in New York. We have a different tradition in terms of trying to respect local autonomy as much as we can. So we try to, from a positive best practice, encouraging point of view, have communities engage in long-term planning. But I do think, and that's why I referenced the previous 07 legislation on AIM, I do think it would make sense if we are going to get to a point where we put a greater priority on funding through AIM, and that certainly would be one way to help our cities that are in trouble. I do think having that requirement be part of that would match assistance with accountability. And I think that's something that would benefit the localities that would be receiving the support and then being more involved with the long-term fiscal planning. And I also think it would do more to send a message about New York State, in its entirety, trying to do a better job of managing finances at both the state level and the local level. So I would see I guess I'll go back to the carrot and stick phrase. If we could come up with some more support, I think that would be a perfect time to not only try to rationalize the AIM formulas, but also put in the requirements so that all the taxpayers in New York that would be supporting that increase could say there's accountability that's going along with that increase. So I think it's a very good point.
Thank you. Let me bring up another dirty word that I didn't hear mentioned today, and that's regionalism.
My God, all these, well, it's not a 4-letter word, but it's all these dirty words.
You shortened it when I bill drafted for you with the compact, which was a form of regionalism. So, it is possible in some ways. It was only a couple of years ago, David Rusk was going around the state and places like Erie County talking about the little boxes,
Right.
and comparing them to cities like Indianapolis and Jacksonville and whatever that were able to plan and act and be economically competitive in a larger sense. And at least he was raising the subject and the dialogue, and it would strike me at a time that is as direly difficult as portrayed by you and by just about everybody else, that ought to be at least on the radar to be talked about.
Yeah. Well, again, it's an important point. It does, regionalism, or if I can expand it to consolidation, is another dirty word. All of that often sounds good to someone until you tell them that it's your community, we're going to regionalize, with the city next door or the school district next door, and suddenly it's, well, wait a minute, that doesn't appeal to me. So I think the way to go at it, and Paul referenced his great service in bill drafting, and he worked with me when we did the Pine Barrens legislation out on Long Island, which was a very interesting regional solution to an environmental and development gridlock that was happening out in Suffolk County. And we were able to come up with a solution that was regional in nature, but included a buy-in by all the local players that crafted the legislation, but more importantly, a mechanism that set up a new entity that the state created, where the local governments in the affected areas had a seat at the table. And now since 1993, that continues to stand out as one of the best collaborative, compact, regionalized efforts to figure out how to preserve an important natural resource and still have appropriate development. I've always thought that structure could work on other issues, transportation particularly. It hasn't happened in New York. I do think that a piece of that is what I touched on, and I would like to see, when we have the money, more money and certainly more incentives for localities to get involved with the local government efficiency grants. Because I think, as someone who lives in I grew up in an unincorporated area, so the town was key. I live in a village now, so I'm in a village, a town. I vote for commissioners for a park district. I vote for sewer commissioners. I vote for fire and water commissioners. I vote for library trustees. I'm always voting, where I'm. And it's a reminder, right, that the kind of government structure we have and the boundaries that were written a long time ago, if we were starting today from scratch, if you were, as part of bill drafting, creating the lines of our municipalities and school districts for this century, it wouldn't look the way it looks right now. But unwinding that and changing that becomes very problematic. And we know in most cases, even on referendums to dissolve villages, I think almost in every case they've gone down in the state. Not every single one, but most. So I think the challenge, and some of this gets to regionalism, although I think that's an even more ambitious agenda, is for us to do a better job of working with local governments to explain how, on a regional basis, if they shared administrative personnel, if they were even more aggressive than many of them are already on joint purchases, on joint bidding, on back office operations to be shared and consolidated on IT functions and so on. My projection is there are hundreds of millions of dollars that could be saved, and you could still do it, I think, in a way that could preserve the local identity that people feel very, very close to. And in some ways, and maybe I'm reflecting my own experience as someone who lives in a county with a lot of local governments, I think it's part of what people have wanted in terms of even in our complex societies wanting to have a sense of a small town identification. It's very hard. Sometimes people say, I moved here because of this. Then they look at the tax bill and they say, well, why did I move here? But it's still, especially when you talk about schools, which let's be honest about it. Your property tax bill, for those outside the city, it's the school taxes that drive, in my community, the big concern about taxation. But once you talk about dramatic changes in jurisdictions, people freeze up and they don't want to hear it. So my suggestion is, certainly on some of the bigger regional issues, without talking about dissolving borders or merging communities together, look at the Pine Barrens legislation that you wrote as a way to set up a regional strategy on issues beyond the issues that were addressed in Pine Barrens. And for the more local concerns about trying to be more efficient and save money, let's try to provide greater incentives for localities to get involved with studying how they can merge services, retaining their local control, retaining their local identity, but still saving money. I think there are ways we could do more than we've done before. It takes openness at the local level, and I'd like to think over time perhaps some more incentives. I know in the state budget they changed the formula in a positive way on the local government efficiency grants, but trying to incentivize through that program more aggressively I think would make some sense. Somebody?
Haley Vaccaro from Gannett News. Moody's just came out with a report saying that the pension smoothing plan would be negative for the long term, and that it could hurt local government's credit and the pension fund. So I wanted to see what your response was to that.
Well, I haven't seen it, so I can comment just based on your question, and when I look at it, if I want to say anything different, we'll follow up with you. The pension smoothing, or the amortization program that we've had available since 2010, was meant to be in response to those local governments that said, we're getting such a spike, we can't manage it with all the other problems that we're having. It was not meant to be an end-all and be-all, and in fact, as I said at the time we did the 2010 program, and I repeat it again with the 2013 program, local government should look very carefully before they choose to amortize. If they really have a severe cash flow problem that will create all kinds of other negative consequences, amortizing a portion of the increase may work. But long term, it does create is an interest charge, because we do have to protect the fund, and it means you will pay 10 years under amortization option 1, 12 years under amortization 2. You will be paying back over an extended period of time. Now, the way the program is set up, which sometimes isn't recognized, it doesn't require that you amortize, or that you amortize the entire portion that you're eligible to amortize. It doesn't require you take 10 years to pay it back. And I believe we have some localities that actually have been paying it back faster. So again, we don't recommend that localities take advantage of it, but when someone says they have a real problem that's going to create all kinds of other budgetary dislocation and make it impossible for a locality to meet the bottom line that they're trying to meet, look at amortization as an option to help get you through this tough and challenging time. Where I think Moody's may be wrong, based on your question, is that the way we have set this option up is that it does not affect the funded status of the plan, because there is an interest payment. Localities have to start paying back the next year. So this is different than what was originally proposed in January. Perhaps Moody's was reflecting the parameters of the initial proposal. But I'm confident that the way the amortization program is structured, and it's a little different than the amortization that was allowed in the early 2000s when we had the last big spike, because this amortization program requires that as the rates start to come down, that after you pay off your amortization, reserve accounts are set up so that you start to pool money to be available for the next time the rates go up, because there is a historic up and down. You know, the mayor was right with his earlier comments in terms of what the rates were years ago. The problem was those rates were artificially low because of outsized market performance. And we tended not to do, we meaning the state and localities, save the money that we knew we'd need when the rates went up. We spent that money. So when the rates went up, suddenly it's, oh my God, the rates are up. Well, we should be more realistic, and of course there's been changes in state law, so we'll never go back down to that 1% or less that people were paying in the late 90s, early 2000. But it's a complex issue in managing pension funds, and I am sensitive to the fact that localities have felt stress. No one requires amortization. In fact, some, even those that are in stress, have chosen not to amortize. Others have found it to be a tool to help get through this tough time. The bottom line for New York, and the message that I want to be clear on, is that we continue to have the best funded of all the big state plans in the country. The worst is, we're through the worst. We have one more year where there's going to be upward pressure on the rates. We value the fund March 31st of every year. Last year we were at 5.96% positive return. Compared to our peers, that was a good number. This year, we don't have our numbers yet because March 31st are the audited numbers, so I don't want to throw out numbers that are an estimate, because this is the real number that will go into our pension fund calculations. But suffice it to say, because we still are heavily dependent on the performance of the public equity markets, I think, as some of you may have read, March was not such a bad month for the public equity markets. I think we're going to have another year, not only of positive return, but of solid return. That confirms my sense that, assuming that we are in a stable period of the markets, while there may be some fluctuation, it's all on the positive side. We will start to see, if not stability, decline coming in the announcement, not this year, but in the year after that. And we will see, as we've seen in the past, we have the peak and then it starts to go down. The number will not go down precipitously. It'll go down in stages, but market performance and then longer term, the changes that we have in New York with 2 new tiers, all of that I think suggests that the pension fund in fact is sustainable and will be able to continue to provide those retirement benefits to our public employees.